Do so, though, I would like for you to bow your heads with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time of study and praise and honor and glory that we are able to give to you. Help us then to be good students, to be good learners and listeners to your will, to model godly behavior, not only in our speech, but also in our behavior, our actions. Allow us to be believers who move both in word and in deed. Give us opportunity to serve. However our lives may be of use to you, let us glorify and honor you. And this is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as we have been doing the last couple of weeks, I'll go ahead and roll us into a few things. If you're joining us online, I should be able to see and read any of the comments that those who are in that environment can bring to the table as well, and I'll try to respond to those as well as anything that takes place here in person. We are looking at the overall section of David's life that for our purposes we're thinking about David in the wilderness. And there are a couple of things that I think are important for us to pay attention to before we look at the overview of these parts of the Old Testament story. Just as it is in some of the other segments and sections of the Old Testament, there are some narrative settings that are going to be explored as the inspired gatherers of God's message are going to present these sections to us with intent and purpose. Sometimes those purposes are laser clear. Like we know exactly why certain things are written. We know that because it tells us at the get-go or it tells us at the close. Two great illustrations of that are the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of John, right at the get-go. Gospel of Luke, that is, right at the get-go. It tells us, this is why I'm doing this. I'm doing this for Theophilus. And so he tells us, this is what my thing is. Whereas the Gospel of John, the full purpose is unveiled at the end. These things are written that you may believe, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so now we have two books in the New Testament, clear purposes. With the Old Testament, it's not always so clear. No, they don't all tell us this book, this segment, this setting is given to us for this reason. Sometimes there's no mention as to authorial intent. Why did God have this person write these things for? Sometimes it is. Some of the prophets, day one, I move this person to speak. But with the historical sections, there are a couple of things that are obvious points we have to remember. Number one, the historical sections sometimes cover the lives of the people they're attributed to, and they die in the story. Moses is cited as the source of information, the primary source for the Pentateuch, and he dies. Joshua dies in the course of those books being read through. And so obviously there's more to that than just, okay, well that guy wrote it and God told him to say it. Maybe it's as simple as guy wrote it, someone else wrote it down, and the guy who was writing it down knew the closing refrains. There's all kinds of possibilities there. Well, that also goes into the realm of intent, because when a book is written matters. And we know that really easily as well. Think about the Gospels again as a great illustration of this. We know they're written after Christ. And so that affects the way we read them. Because they're written after the work of Christ, we read them as rearward looking. That everything is have happened, if you will. Like, okay, this took place, this took place, this took place. And then we think about how God, in that message, is telling us that the Spirit or the Helper will come and He's going to explain everything. Well, with the historical section of the Old Testament, we really kind of have two options for when to put these books on the shelf, if you will. And you're left with either pre-exile or post-exile. And if you remember in the story of God's people, they go into captivity. Their major captivity is 3 steps into it and 3 steps out. And in the 3 steps out, you have Nehemiah and Ezra. You have the return. You have the rebuilding of what we would consider the second temple that was later expanded by King Herod. Okay, well, what goes on in those phases? Does that affect the writing or our interpretation of the text? Sometimes it can. I will suggest to you that with these Samuel documents and with the Kings documents and with the Chronicles documents, we're looking at stuff that is going to be more leaning into somewhere after the bulk of the kings. They've already lived and died, obviously. And most likely we're looking at late events, post-exile settings, because they cover some of that stuff. The kings go to the demise of the nation. And so it's going to have to take place after that history takes place, because it's not written as a prophetic book. It's written as we're looking back. We're thinking about what has happened. We're thinking about what is seen. And so keep that in mind. That helps us with interpretation, because we know our audience. We know the context of the audience. What they would need spiritually is maybe a little bit more in our grasp in that way. Also, the setting matters in this section of David's life too. I don't know about you, but I have to remind myself, even having been to the region, when the Bible says wilderness, I have to say not forest, not mountains, and not trees like I'm accustomed to. Because if I said to any of you, hey, let's go out in the wilderness, and we live here in Sharpsburg, Georgia, what does wilderness look like to us? Right across the road. It means pine trees. Like right around here, if it's wilderness, it means pine trees. That's not biblical wilderness in the context of David's life. That's not even anything remotely close to most of our stuff, with the possible exception of the Little Grand Canyon, which is down south. And you can kind of get a little feel for the flavor of what the wilderness might be like. And here really why this is important, because in the wilderness section of David's life, he is away from people. He is away from those who would be servants of God in some ways. He's sometimes isolated. He is away on certain levels with God's people. And so all of these things are important factors for us to think through and to kind of work through on the interpretive level as well. Like, what's David seeing and experiencing? So a way to connect it is just to always remember, on a literary level and on a this is what God is teaching us level, think about the Exodus. Because where David goes is where Israel went. And here's the great parallel. How did Israel survive in the wilderness? They had to have God. And they had to have God in what way? What did God provide for them in simple terms? Leadership, food, water. I think someone else said everything. The clothes didn't wear out. Like, full care. Now that's a practical thing, because the wilderness space is not full of trees, plants, and things to glean and gather. It's not full of critters you can get to eat and make food. You got to have some support there. You got to plan ahead or have it waiting for you when you get there. There are wadis, which you can consider the equivalent of an oasis, and that's where water streams through on an irregular basis, and that gives you a little bit of life. Some of those wadis create cave areas, and they become the structure around which the story itself takes place. And so this whole section also includes, for David's perspective, a couple of other key things. What are some of the storytelling that God did to tell us about his people with the Exodus? And this is not just getting out of the throne room of Moses and Pharaoh, but how do the people leave? Is everything great and kosher, if we're going to use Hebrew idioms? Is everything great when they leave Egypt? No. What does the Pharaoh want to do with Egypt? With Israel when they leave? Bring them back, right? Or what seems more likely based on his behavior? Eventually. Kill them all. Like, it's really awful. There's instances where they're only found protected because God stands up for them. They go into closed-off canyon, box canyon context, and you see them in that setting. Hey, this is where we're at, and they can't fight for themselves, and God fights for them. And so you have them being pursued by the army of a king that they used to serve. You see David in that at all? Here's another thing. They go into the wilderness. We've already pointed it out. When they get there, are they welcomed in the wilderness? Not really. In fact, it's a series of conflicts. It's a series of we're not getting along, nobody's getting along. It seems like everything's not going well, and so you have a lot of that. And so you have some conflict that takes place there. And then now let's add a couple more things into the setting and the place for all of that. Do they interact with the natives? Some marrying that takes place. There's some tribal fights that take place. There's the stealing of women that take place. There is an attempt to seek peace. I mean, there's a lot of awful experiences. A lot of that is a very similar backstory to what David goes through. So think it through again, like when we're reading this text and we're thinking about David in this element. Here is Israel. They've escaped the clutches of the evil Egyptian Pharaoh. And as they escape and they're fleeing, they go across the Reed or the Red Sea, and they see God close up victory for them. And then they go a little farther, and there's conflict, but in the end they emerge. The story that gets through Joshua, they emerge over the promised land as the chosen people of God, and God grants them this kingdom. All right, here's David. David's the anointed of God, much like Israel and Egypt. He's God's chosen. His journey, his story is very much the same journey and story of Israel going through Egypt. They're moving along, and David encounters conflict. Some of it is to do with the prior king or prior leadership that God had selected. And that's going to get sorted out. But in the end, he escapes the clutches of his evil king who is chasing him, wanting his death. That goes forward a little further, and we finally see him in the wilderness. He survives the wilderness, and he arrives to the end of his hero's journey, and he is the king of Israel. And he's the kind of king that brings great expansion or blessing to the land. Now, if you're thinking through like what's going on, elements of understanding and elements and tidbits of ideas here, if you go with the basic model or a simple approach of what you're seeing there, is to kind of catch and recognize, hey, right here, this is the story coming to its fullness and the story coming to its completion. Well, here we have David being the full embodiment of kingship and the full layout of the blessings returning to Israel is another way to think about it. And that kingdom expands. All right, so let's narrow down our focus. We've got all of that there. And I want to point this out. I don't know if my sound got fixed. There were several folks online that were saying they couldn't hear. Maybe I fixed that. I tried to press some buttons, and let's see if that actually made some differences. Maybe it didn't. If not, I can fix it tonight for those that weren't able to be with us this evening, and they'll get a copy of the audio later this evening. So here's some things. Number one, with this expansion model coming in, when we narrow into the events in chapter 22, let's kind of think about that. We begin to see the character of Saul rise to what it fell to. And I say like it rises up, there's a balance that exists in the life of people. And we are going to rise to God, and when we do that, we fall away. We see this dropping away of worldly ideas, or we're going to rise to evil. And we drop away all semblance of our righteousness. Well, in the conflict between our two kings, Saul and David, they both rise to their appointed places. Even though one is a rise to his demise, the other one is a rise to his full plan. And so with that shift there, you go into chapter 22 and you see Saul's experiences kind of lay themselves out. The text begins, chapter 22. Saul heard that David was discovered and the men who were with him Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree at the height with his spear in his hand, and all of his servants were standing around him. Again, you now have this image of a giant. Remember, how much bigger is Saul than the rest? He's a giant. He's bigger than the average Israelite, taller than all of them. And how is he shown? He's sitting there with a spear. Thinking back to David, thinking back to Israel, what does that look like real quick like? Does that seem like any of the other earlier antagonists in this story that God is telling us? The history of Israel? Like Goliath. Yeah, it's like a little baby Goliath. He's not Goliath, but he's kind of like Goliath. And by the way, his morality structure is a lot more like Goliath. Saul's was. Because Goliath was all about Goliath. I can take all you little puny Israelites. I will crush all of you. Well, Saul is then kind of shown to us as a template copy, if you will, of Goliath in that setting. Now, if you know the whole story of God, and this is the first time you're thinking back through it again, you should already kind of know what's going to happen to Saul. Like, David's already beat his Goliath. You're Saul. And I already just read back in, chapter 16, and before, where the Spirit of God has shifted to. So you can think about David here versus Goliath as David is the real champion, and Goliath now is the paper tiger. He looks like he's dangerous, but the worst you're going to get out of him is a paper cut, from our perspective. Is David, though, afraid of Goliath, or is David, though, afraid of his Goliath now, which is Saul? Absolutely, on many levels. If you think back to their interactions, even back in chapter 21, verse 19, David's already fleeing from him, and the conditions in the castle, if you will, in the fortress or the palace of Saul, is one of deep abuse. Raise your hand if anyone's ever thrown a spear at you. I feel like I can get away with asking that question and no one's going to say yes. But could David have answered that question? He said, yeah, not only anybody, but like literally the guy I'm trying to make feel better with my music wants to kill me. And the dynamic of all the false promises and all of that. So it helps us kind of grasp that part of it. But then it shifts right into a secondary narrative. And why do you think, from looking at what we see here in 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22 as an example, why is David moving into this area of the wilderness and in this area in general? Like, why is he moving from populated areas into the wilderness and beyond? What's his planning stage? How is he going to make this work for himself? Yeah. And if you think about chapter 21, we didn't really start there. Did he go and get supplies of any kind, anything important to take with him? He got something really important to protect himself. Now, I want you to think for a second. He goes back and gets this sword. Back when he got it the first time, is he someone who's got a lifetime of training with the sword? Not even about what size sword this is or the type of structure you would have and whether he's big enough to wield it, all separate issues. Is he a swordsman in his youth? I kind of know the answer to this in some ways, but I'm certainly not a swordsman by any standard. But is it easy to learn how to fight with a sword? Can I just pick it up and go? You can pick it up and cut yourself. I can guarantee that with 100% accuracy. Now, you can definitely do that. So he's got a sword, but he doesn't have a heritage of using a sword. So why is it important for him to have that sword? What does that sword present to him or give to him? Is it economically valuable to him? Is it like he's going to sell it on the black market? Hey, I got a sword over here. You want to buy it? Is that what he wants it for? Right, it's a symbol. Like, it's basically like, hey, look, it's my trophy. Now, that's an important thing for us to think about, because is that really an Israelite thing to do? We see Israel taking trophies like that a lot and being like, it's totally cool to keep the spoils of war that maybe are like idols. But he's kind of treating the sword like Israel treated the ark. A little sketchy in some of that levels. And yet, it's still a symbol of victory. So we don't know how it's going to play out. It's concerning when you read it. Like, hey, he's got this sword. What's he going to do with it? We know he can't really fight with it, and he's certainly not going to take a kingdom with one sword by himself. That's not really how it works. It certainly isn't how it plays out. And here's another thing, and it kind of sets the stage for this sketchy interlude in David's development here. How does he get him? Does he just say, hey, that's my sword. I want it. The priests have it. Kind of weird there. Like, why do the priests have a sword? It doesn't seem very Israelite-y worship-wise if you think back to the old law, right? We don't see them saying, hey, then when you set up your tabernacle, place the sword of the defeated enemies right there next to the ephod or next to an idol. Like, that doesn't make sense there. But what's the story? Does he tell them a story? What's the story that the text tells us? We're on the king's business. I'm on the king's business. Is there any narrative event in chapters 21 and before where the king says, go get your sword? Interpretively, then we have two options. Either David is lying. It's a perfectly legitimate reading of the text. Or, well, I guess three. Or there's stuff we don't know. Always possible. There's a lot of stuff I don't know, even about these stories. Or there's a last one. In his role as being the anointed, there's something going on there. He's the king who's not yet the king. So we're not quite sure what's going on. It gives us some more a little mystery there. The whole story eventually gets revealed. Some of the answers that we want don't get provided for us, but they do present themselves. Chapter 22 moves in, and David now with his trophy, he's got all his supplies, and the supplies seem to need a sword to demonstrate that he's who he says he is in some way. And he goes into these other areas and hides in the caves. Some of you may have done this. How many of you guys have been in cave systems before? I've been in some cave systems, right? It's kind of an otherworldly thing. Caves across the globe have a lot of similarities, mainly because once you get inside those caves, nothing can really grow. Like there's no light, photosynthesis doesn't work, and so different types of plant life can be found there, different kinds of animal life can be found there, but they all kind of are similar. Mainly they're dead. Mainly there's a lot of not stuff there. If there's moisture, then they're damp and muddy and dead. And so you have a whole lot of that space. So this is where David is going to go hide, in these cave sections. There's another thing that's interesting about those cave sections. Because there's not a lot of living stuff in there, if there's something else in there, you kind of know to a degree. And it's kind of creepy. So that kind of creates this kind of narrative space. If you can imagine David in these spaces. And the caves in this region are interconnected caves. They're honeycombed, if you will. And so they're not like, here's a cave, and then over here's a cave. The caves are created because of the water flows in the region. Those water flows create the equivalent of crisscrossing tunnel systems. And in that section and in that region there is where David goes to hide. And in those settings, he's fleeing still from Saul, and he's going to encounter and build what we can consider an army around him. If you'll notice, you're talking about Saul and David and some of these events that move into, say, chapter 24 as a destination point when Saul is pursuing him. There's some interactions of conflict, but David eventually gets an army around him. By the way, does anyone remember the nature of this army that he has? Well, there's a family connection to a certain degree, but isn't there like a bunch of worthless fellows that come into play as well? Yeah. Yeah, so Saul has the proper army, trained soldiers as well as, and I'll use broadly, righteous Israelites. These are the people that are of age to go to war. Some of them may have seen conflict, veterans of the Goliath campaign. David's army, worthless fellows. If you think about this in the contrast, what would you define, just using that terminology, what kind of biblical imagery might come into play with these worthless fellows? Who finds his final stand surrounded by worthless fellows? Anybody in the Bible, I don't know, at the end of their days, surrounded by two worthless guys? Jesus. So there's a positive type in the future. But are thieves worthless fellows? Yeah. Layabouts? I mean, so you've got this, his gaggle is not an army. These are kind of the refugees of the area. Low or broken or poor or impoverished or just troublemakers. And he gathers them up into what seems to be, by their behavior, the equivalent of a press gang. He's got a posse where Saul has an army. He's got a gang where Saul has the throne still, even though he is the anointed of God. And so there's a conflict that's coming in this gradual usurping. And then in chapter 23, around, say, verse 15 or so, as the story moves forward, David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. David's not so invisible that his best bud can't find him. But he's so invisible in some way that Saul isn't able to find him. That's a weird textual conflict in some levels. But here's one level to think through. Which of those two people has the Spirit of God? David does. Which of those two people behaves in a very mentally strangled state where it doesn't seem like he's in his right mind? Saul does. So that makes more sense then. Like Saul, we might use accommodative terms, like he seems like he's off his rockers a little bit, like he's just not all in his right mind, and because he's not. What's that event that takes place? We read about this earlier. What comes? An evil spirit. You think about it in a personal and practical way. I think most of us are familiar with the mild stress form of being, I think the term is hangry, right? You're so hungry, you're angry. Like you can see that behavior in ourselves and others, and then it eventually passes, and you just kind of accept the fact you're not going to eat right now. That's nothing. By comparison to the direct influence of what is cited in the text as a spirit meant to torment or create chaos or evil. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of difficulties that I think we have to kind of work through and identify and acknowledge. So let's go ahead and keep that in this space. Then we get to chapter 24, verse 1. In these settings, in this cave that I've already described for you, in the place where Saul is known to be hunting to kill you, and you have the testimony of the son of the sitting king who is your friend that he's trying to kill you, and he's tried to kill you before, and he's made havoc of your life, and you know that God stripped the spirit from him and gave it to you. We get to chapter 24. When you walk through that text, does it surprise you what David does? He's got the giant killer sword with him, right? Because he's got the sword. He killed one giant with this. The text opens up in some of our earlier pictures where Saul is shown to be standing there like the charioteer, the big giant Goliath, and we see him that way Well, clearly that's what's going to happen. David's going to take his life. I mean, isn't that how we would write the story today? If we were the story makers and we're going to make a movie out of this, well, clearly, here it is. Is that what David does? He does the opposite. Now, he sends a message. What kind of message does he send him? Yeah, a little slice. From the recipient side, you're thinking through, like, I'm Saul, and maybe I have a moment of clarity. That's going to freak you out. But he's already freaked out. By the way, if you want a little narrative connection to one of the prophets, think about Elijah and his great battles with the prophets of Baal. When that conflict goes forth and the false prophets are demanding of their God to come down, and they're saying, come and bring the fire. What's the mockery that Elijah uses? Yeah. One of the literal translations of that mockery is he in the bathroom? Is he going to the potty? Now, here's the literary connection. This is exactly the kind of event that David catches Saul in. So it gives us a second thing to think about. Because if you think back to the law, and someone who was culturally of Israel, like David, is this a clean moment or an unclean moment in the broad sense of cultural Israel? It's an unclean moment. David shouldn't see his nakedness. He shouldn't be present there. So there's a sense of David accomplishing his goal as being who he needs to be, and yet not violating that law. So whatever was going on in that, got to go get my sword, got to get my side things, or things aren't really looking like he's really the Israelite king we need him to be. This actually is the kind of king they need, who balances the pressure to be king and the I'm the king drive of I am in charge and I should go do this with time and place. It was not the time or the place for now at least two conceptual reasons. One, God hadn't sealed out the last part of his plan. Whatever he had in store yet, that hasn't come up. And to David, cultural law, textual law, Levitical law, law from Moses mattered. Did it matter at all to Saul? Does it seem to matter to him? Not that I can read. Maybe with lip service, but he doesn't have a cultural background to really grab to that and the overall layout of David experiencing some of these things. So, by the way, those events take place roughly in the first few verses of chapter 24. Afterwards, verse 8. Afterwards, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, for by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you, as the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes wickedness. But my hand shall not be against you. After whom the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. I think, again, you kind of think through that and you have the opportunity to see, acknowledge, and recognize a lot of what's going on there. A lot of the details and the richness of the text come out in a full and hopefully complete way. You see who David becomes at that point. This is the David, this is the king that we needed. This is the king that Israel needed. The king that could hold back when his security was at risk. As compared to Saul. Was Saul any good at holding back? No, Saul was good at taking and taking credit for. So with that in mind, I think it's probably a good time for us to scoot forward a little bit and think about some of those key questions that we've brought up in the past and explore them with a little bit more time on the clock than we did last week. And if you've got other questions or comments about this section of the life of David, this is a great time for it as well. But to begin with, in the text here, what parts of it did you like? When you're looking at it and you're going, hey, this is something that I really felt like was interesting, or this was something that was great for my faith, or I didn't notice it before, and this time I got to see it again. What you got? Bobby first, then Michael.
David cut off Saul's skirt. Evidently, he didn't have a skirt on. He must have it laying beside him, because if you try to cut cloth while it's on somebody, they're going to feel it tugging.
You certainly would be hoping that you're aware, but I'll say this. I have seen and been present in places where pickpockets work, and they are slippery and sneaky. There are ways that they can distract you, or you can be self-distracted. But the text doesn't give us a lot of hint. There's a lot more to Saul's level of dissonance, his disconnection with his world, than maybe we can acknowledge or see. So that's something really interesting to see. Michael?
I love the group of men he had, the description that every man was distressed, every man had a creditor, every embittered man. You think about David when he took Goliath, he was such an underdog. Because he's just so careful. And here we have another group that seems like they definitely be such an underdog. It's like that part.
Well, yeah, and I think Israel is, in absence of God, Israel is not a nation of consequence. The majority of the story of Israel being shown to us in the text is one that shows their rise comes to their commitment to the covenant, and their fall comes through their failure to keep the covenant. They are an underdog. They're not big, they're not mighty, they're not warriors, but they do have Jehovah, and that's their key component. And they're in an area where having Jehovah brings blessings to them, brings rain and a fertile ground and a fertile environment. And so that's a really big thing. And I think David's the underdog, Israel's the underdog, is a great kind of connection, because you see those two birth of a king, birth of a nation stories play out in Exodus, and then now in the mini-Exodus, which is what David himself is going through. And by the way, this is something interesting too. There's a third Exodus, right? Where does Jesus go from his birth until he returns from a foreign land? Where does Jesus go hide for a little while? He goes to Egypt. And so there's a messianic kind of layering of Israel did this. David goes into the wilderness. Jesus goes into the wilderness. And by the way, where is John preaching that makes the announcement of the Christ? In the wilderness. And so you kind of see these things play out with a level of repetition. And I like that a lot about the text, is to see that story repeat, because for the way I remember things, that's how I remember stuff. Repetition. Not rote repetition, but hey, this is doing the same thing. Like, okay, this happened this way, okay. What changed? What's different in this telling of people's history, God's people, that was different. Here's a big one. How many of you have questions that you want answered from this part of David's life? I got 10 toes and 10 fingers for a start of all the questions that I have. But do you guys have things you want answered from this part of the story of God's people? I got more than a few. Let me lay out a couple of them. What's going on with why David gathers his small little army around him? What are those people like? What's going on with the sword? What's going on with David's behavior when he's hiding? He certainly seems to act in his hiding phase like Saul acted like. And by the way, his behavior is kind of similar to a court bard, the jester, the joker, the crazy guy. What's going on with that? I want to know more. Those are things I may not get the answer to it, but that doesn't mean I don't want to know more about it. What else did you guys see in there that seems like something that you would love to have answered?
Okay, is he still married at this time?
Right, marital status. Like, what went on with all of that?
He was supposed to be married to Mike. Has that happened, or is it going?
There's a whole lot of, like, David's life that for many known and unknown reasons aren't fleshed out for us. And I say some things are known in that later down the road, we're kind of backstoried in. We learn that eventually David has more than just a single wife. He's got some sort of, in the culture in this area, you would have what will be considered a second-class wife. Sometimes referred into translations as a mistress, but it's not a mistress because you're actually united. But it's not equivalent to the marriages that took place with the patriarchs. And by the way, when Solomon becomes king, does he inherit some wives? Is that weird? Does that seem weird to you based on your appreciation of marriage in the full picture from Genesis to Revelation? Well, absolutely it seems weird. And it's not, and none of that stuff is spelled out in detail for us. Like, details like that aren't given. Plus, we don't know what happens to the rest of this family unit that could have been produced there. And eventually, Bathsheba is the queen of note. Everybody else is of less importance to David's life later down the road. And that's not spelled out for us either, although you might make the assumption as to why is Bathsheba really important? Well, who's her son? Solomon, and that's a big deal. You know, if you're trying to write a history of the kings, do you really care about the rest of the wives if you're focusing on the kings? Now, that doesn't mean they don't matter, but from a literary standpoint, they don't have the space you're giving to them. And they may not tell the story you want to tell. God may not want that story for us, or maybe he does. Those are all kinds of I don't knows. What do these stories teach us about people? This section of David's life, do we learn anything about people in general?
You can show mercy when you don't expect it.
Yeah, did anyone expect mercy out of David in those events? From a human perspective. What do humans tend to want? Vengeance or revenge? And both of those things are defined well in the Bible text. We quote this passage, who owns vengeance? Do we sometimes mistake revenge for vengeance? Yeah, because what is vengeance if I take it into my own hands? It's revenge. It's a returning of punishment rather than God's judgment. And we tend to, I think, in the way that we approach the text, I know I struggle with this and maybe you do as well, we create the superhero mentality where I'm going to step into the role as the superhero, as the Moses, as the David, and win the day. And the way in which Moses or David win the day is not through superpowers. Not even the prophets who had miraculous connections win necessarily through superpower. They win essentially through superior faith. Yeah, right. Back in chapter 22, when he's on Nob, and there's that whole secondary event there, like, what's going on with that? Well, how far has Saul moved from God? He's risen to this king like the nations around him. But how far has he come from God? Wherever he started, and that's kind of sketchy, he's way off of the reservation now. By the way, does this clarify for us what did the people want? They wanted a king like whom? Did God pick well when answering that request? If you want to think about it on one level. He gave them exactly what kings look like in the other nations. If you think just of the section in chapter 24 and verse 8 when there's this whole narrative of David going, look, I'm not trying to be treacherous to you. I could have and I didn't. Read the history of any other nation in that region. And the concept of regicide is normal. You kill off all the old as you usher in the new. That's a normal thing. It's normalized in those areas for how transitions of power took place. And David's like, I'm not doing that. In fact, I'm waiting. I could, but I'm not. And I served you, and I'm still now serving you. And you see that. And you learn a lot about Saul. You learn something about David. But you also learn about us. Because as much as we will tell ourselves, I want to be David, I want to be Moses, we also find ourselves behaving like Saul. And every biblical villain exists because the villainy that is potentially within us. And so when you see Saul, unfortunately, you see you and I. There's an axiom or a kind of a term that gets used. What does absolute power do? It has the potential to corrupt absolutely. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Saul had absolute power. And then he was a king like all the nations around him, exactly what they asked for, and he became exactly what they wanted. And that was exactly what they got. David is showing up to be not that. By the way, is he perfect? No, we read some of the texts recently Sunday that connect to Psalm 51, and in that connection there, a key point is recognize and acknowledge that David is not like any of the other ones, except in the matter with Bathsheba. And so that abbreviated extra clause kind of shows there's more there. What does this teach us about Jesus and God? God's seen a little bit further down the field than man is. How many of us would have picked Saul? I don't know. He looked like a king. I don't have the mindset that says I'm any better than the Israelites of that century. I could have been tempted to want a king just like them. How many of us would have picked David? Remember, not even the prophet picked him. And he's on a closer relationship than general Israel. It's more likely that we would have picked a Saul than a David. And in seeing God, we have to recognize that he sees further down the field, maybe with different perspectives, different sight lines, different ideas than we do. And so we learn that God is a planner. We also learn he's gracious. Because how long had the kingdom been stripped from him? And yet Saul still lives? I don't know all the details there because the Bible doesn't tell us all the things. But God is being gracious to Saul as this gets worked out. In general, I think that's one of the things that God is teaching us. What else is God teaching us in this part of the history of Israel? Yeah, and I also thought about this exactly. I thought about like when this is written. Because it's after all these events, part of what I see in the text, and maybe you see this, maybe you don't, it's a way to read through it, is that the narratives of here are telling us what kind of king to look for. If you look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you get a good data bank that you can lay beside the law and say, what should a king look like? And in the end, how many kings come even close to the standard? Pretty few, right? So you're looking for a king like David in the end. David's not perfect, but really the way that the structure of the Old Testament history is laid out is David was the best they had, even though Solomon was the wealthiest they had. Because does the end of Solomon end with Solomon being righteous? But the end of David, though not spelled out in details, and it's not giving us this early Genesis that he walked with God, it is giving us, in the latter kind of pictures of it, he did his best except for. And in that instance, we have a whole narrative of what he did that was wrong, how he addressed it, how it was resolved, how it was solved. Guilt was accepted. He acknowledged that he had done the things. No blame shifting, no guilt by proxy. And so with that, I think God's teaching us what to look for in the king that will come. Is Jesus like David in any way? I know you can argue that David is like Jesus in the other direction because Jesus was first, but let's just stick with the order we can go with. Bobby?
I think Christ is like, David is like Christ in a lot of ways because he showed mercy to Saul when Saul didn't show mercy to anybody.
Yeah, you see mercy. Obviously, he's the royal line, and so there's that connection there. He's a king that relies and waits for God to tell him to move. Jesus was one who was incremental in that way. I do what God tells me to do. Whatever my Father's will is in heaven is what I will accomplish, and then that's where he ended. He just that's it. So there's a lot of similarity there. Jesus then is revealed to us as being prophet, priest, and king, and so we're going to see a number of other illustrations that will tie together his role as prophet. You can connect it to Moses and other prophets. Priest, you can connect it to the priestly role, but not exactly because he's not like those priests. Next week, we're going to look at the end of Saul and his final downfall, which then will also prep us to look to the rise of David. And David as actual king will come soon on the table. So I want to encourage you to continue to read through those things. At this time, though, we're going to ask Michael to close out our time of study with prayer. And Michael, would you do that right now, please?